the 4th of May, 1471. The two cousins, the Yorks and the Lancastrian army, are coming here to Tewksbury. On the 4th of May in 1471, one of the most decisive battles of the Wars of the Roses took place in England. The Wars of the Roses was between two cousins, the Lancastrian and the Yorks, and King Edward and his forces, loyal to his House of York, completely defeated those of the rival House of Lancaster at the Battle of Tewksbury. The Lancastrian heir to the throne, Edward, Prince of Wales, the most prominent Lancastrian nobles were killed during this battle or executed. The Lancastrian king, Henry, who was a prisoner in the Tower of London, died shortly after the battle. And what remains of how he died is a mystery. Some people say he was murdered by the three York brothers, George, Duke of Clarence, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who was the most famous one as being Richard III, and then their brother Edward, who was king. But however he died, it restored political stability to England until the death of Edward in 1483, when it would set alight again with Richard III taking the throne from his nephews, and would only end when Henry defeated Richard III on the Battle of Bosworth, and then the Tudors began their rule. The term Wars of the Roses refers to the heraldic badges of the two rival houses, which had been contending for the English throne since the late 1450s. In 1461, the Yorkist claimant Edward, Earl of March, was proclaimed King Edward and defeated the supporters of the weak and insane Lancastrian king Henry at the Battle of Towton. The Lancastrian then revolted in the far north of England, but then they were defeated in 1464. The fugitive King Henry was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London. His wife, Margaret of Anjou, and their 13-year-old son, Edward of Westminster, were exiled. Edward's hold on the throne appeared to be secure, but, of course, this was only temporary, as Margaret of Anjou would not go down easily. Edward owed his victory in large to the support of his cousin, who was a very powerful, the Earl of Warwick. And his daughters would also play a key role in the Wars of the Roses. But Edward became estranged with Warwick due to the fact he did not marry who Warwick wanted him to marry. Instead, he married Elizabeth Woodville and slighted the French diplomatic marriage. Elizabeth Woodville was not only a widow, which in those days was not good, but also she was a widow of a Lancastrian gentleman. And in secret they married Edward and Elizabeth in 1464. When the marriage became public knowledge, Edward placed many of his new Queen's family all in powerful and prominent positions in court, and Warwick got very angry. So the embittered Warwick secured the support of Edward's jealous brother, George Plantagenet, who was the first Duke of Clarence, and in a coup they exchanged a promise to make Clarence the king. Although Edward was imprisoned briefly, Clarence was unacceptable as a monarch to most of the country, and Edward was allowed to resume his rule. And outwardly, him and Warwick seemed to reconcile, as well as Clarence as well. They all seemed to be one happy family. But then, within a year, he was accused of a fresh treachery and was forced to flee in France. For Warwick, his best hope of regaining power in England was not to restore Clarence on the throne anymore. That clearly didn't work. But it was now to restore Henry to the throne. And Louis of France feared this hostile alliance of Burgundy under the Charles of Bold of England under Edward. So he supported Warwick with men and money, and then gave legitimacy to any uprising by Warwick. And then here's where Margaret of Anjou comes back in. She, if you remember, was exiled in France with her son. Warwick, who was an enemy of Margaret of Anjou, pleaded with her at the House of Lancaster, then allied with the House of Warwick. And the Prince Edward of Wales, her son, was betrothed to Warwick's youngest daughter, Anne. And the marriage was eventually solemnised in Ambrose on the 13th of December in 1470. Finally, they swore their loyalty to Henry VI on a fragment of true cross in Angers Cathedral. However, Margaret declined to let Prince Edward land in England or land there herself until Warwick had established a firm government and made the country safe for them. So Warwick landed in England on the 13th of September in 1470. He was accompanied by George, Duke of Clarence, and another important player here, Jasper Tudor, who would be looking after the future King Henry VII, who would be the first Tudor king. As King Edward made his way south to face Warwick, he realised that Warwick's brother John, Marquis of Montague, who had up until then remained loyal to Edward, defected. He then fled to King's Lynn, where he then took a ship to Flanders, which is a part of Burgundy, accompanied by his youngest brother, Richard of Gloucester. In London, Warwick released the king and led him in a procession to St. Paul's Cathedral and installed him in Westminster Palace. This then meant the Lancastrians were back on the throne. For Duke of Clarence, as I said, he was jealous. He was jealous because he wanted to be king, and he had secretly reconciled with his brother, who was King Edward. Edward landed inconspicuously one night as the ships had all scattered by bad weather, and his men landed in small detachments over a wide area on the 14th of March. The port of Kingston upon Hull actually refused Edward to enter, so he made for York. He then began to march south. Near Pontefract Castle he evaded the troops of Warwick and Warwick's brother Montague. By the time Edward reached the town of Warwick, he had gathered enough support to proclaim himself king again. The Earl of Warwick sent urgent requests for Queen Margaret, who was gathering fresh forces in France to join him in England as quickly as possible. Edward, however, knew Clarence was ready to turn his coat again and betray Warwick, his father-in-law. So he marched rapidly west and joined with Clarence's men, who were approaching from Gloucestershire. Clarence appealed to Warwick to surrender, but Warwick refused to speak to him. Edward's army made rapidly for London, pursued by Warwick and Montague. London was supposedly defended by the 4th Duke of Somerset, but he was absent and the city became Edward's. The unfortunate and by now very feeble Henry VI was sent back to the Tower again. Edward then turned about to face Warwick's army, and on the 14th of April they met at the Battle of Barnet. In a confusing fight of thick fog, some of Warwick's army attacked each other by mistake, and Montague died in that battle, and Warwick was cut down trying to reach his horse to escape. Unbeknown to Margaret this time, she and Prince Edward and his now wife, Anne Neville, who was the daughter of Warwick, had landed at Weymouth on the same day as the Battle of Barnet was fought. While Margaret sheltered at a nearby Cerne Abbey, the Duke of Somerset brought the news of the disaster to Barnet to her. She briefly wished to return to France, but Prince Edward persuaded her to gamble for victory. Somerset and the Earl of Devon had already raised an army for Lancaster in the West County. Their best hope was to march northward and join the Lancastrians in Wales, led by Jasper Tudor. In London, King Edward had learned of Margaret's landing by this point, only 2 days after she had arrived. Although he had given many of his supporters troops leave after the victory at Barnet, he nonetheless was able to rapidly muster a force at Windsor. It was difficult at first to determine Margaret's intentions, as the Lancastrians had set up several suggestions that they may be making directly for London, but Edward's army set out to the West County within a few days. On the 30th of April, Margaret's army had reached Bath, on its way towards Wales. In the city of Bristol, she secured reinforcements and money. Lancastrians had made towards Little Sodbury, which is northeast of Bristol. Nearby was Sodbury Hill, an Iron Age hill fort that was an obvious strategic point for the Lancastrians to seize. When Yorkist scouts reached the hill, there was a sharp fight in which they suffered heavy casualties. Believing that the Lancastrians were about to offer battle, Edward temporarily halted his army while the stragglers caught up with the remainder, and so they could rest after their rapid march from Windsor. However, the Lancastrians instead made a swift move north in the night, passing within 3 miles of Edward's army. By the morning of the 2nd, they had gained safety at Berkeley Castle. King Edward realised the Lancastrians were seeking to cross the River Severn and into Wales. The nearest crossing point that they could use was the city of Gloucester. He sent urgent messages ordering Sir Richard Beauchamp to bar the gates so Margaret and the men couldn't get through. When Margaret arrived on the morning of the 3rd, Beauchamp refused her summons to let her army pass, and she realised that there was insufficient time to storm the city before Edward's army arrived. Instead, her army made way, forced to march another 10 miles to Tewkesbury, attempting to reach the next bridge at Upton upon Severn, which was 7 miles further on. Edward, meanwhile, had marched no less than 31 miles, 50 kilometres, passing through Cheltenham, which was more than just a little village at that time, in the late afternoon. The day was very hot, and both the Lancastrians and Edward's pursuing army were both exhausted by this point. The Lancastrians were forced to abandon some of their artillery, which was captured by the Yorkist reinforcements. At Tewksbury, the tired Lancastrians halted for the night. Most of their army were footmen and unable to continue further with no rest, and even the mounted troops were weary by this time. By contrast, King Edward's army was now composed and mainly of mounted men, who nonetheless dismounted to fight on foot as most English armies did during this period. Edward drove his army to make another march from Cheltenham, finally halting 3 miles from the Lancastrians. The Lancastrians knew that they could retreat no further before Edward attacked from the rear, and they would be forced to give battle. As the day broke on the 4th of May, the Lancastrians took up that defensive position a mile south of the town of Tewksbury. To their rear was the River Avon and Severn. Tewkesbury Abbey was just behind the Lancastrian centre. A farmhouse, then known as Grove's Hall, marked the centre of the Lancastrian position. Nearby was Margaret's camp. Queen Margaret is said to have spent the night at Grove's Hall before hastily taking refuge the day of the battle in a religious house some distance from the battlefield. The Lancastrian army numbered approximately 6,000, likely outnumbering the Yorkists by only a few hundred. It was organised into 3 battles. The right battle was commanded by the Duke of Somerset. The Lancastrian centre was commanded by Lord Wenlock. Prince Edward was present at the centre. At 17, Prince Edward was no stranger to battlefields, having been given by his mother the task of condemning to death Yorkist prisoners taken at the Second Battle of St. Albans. But he did lack experience of actual command. Edward's army, the Yorks, numbered around 5,000 to 6,000. Like the Lancastrians, King Edward organised his army also into 3 battles. Edward's vanguard was commanded by his youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who was then only 18 years old. Richard was already an experienced commander by this point and had led a division at the Battle of Barnet. Edward himself commanded the main battle, in which Clarence was also stationed. Edward was 29 at this time and in the height of his prowess as a soldier. His lifelong friend and supporter, Lord Hastings, commanded the rear and was also a very experienced commander. As they moved into position, King Edward's army found the ground was so broken up by the woods, ditches, embankments that it was difficult to attack in any sort of order. However, the Yorkists were ready. Their archers and artillery showered the Lancastrians, and arrows were shot. The Yorkers certainly had more guns than their enemies, either to escape the cannons and volleys of archery, or because he saw an opportunity to outflank King Edward's isolated battle. The Duke of Somerset led at least part of his men via some of the evil lanes to attack Edward's left flank. Although taken by surprise, Edward's men resisted, beating back Somerset's attack. Somerset's battle had not gone the way he wanted, and his surviving troops tried to escape across the Severn. Most were cut down as they fled. The long meadow astride the Colnbrook, leading down to the river, is known to this day as the Bloody Meadow. Somerset galloped up to Wenlock, commanding the centre, and demanded to know why Wenlock had failed to support him. According to legend, recounted in Edward's Hall's Chronicle, written several years afterwards, he did not wait for an answer, but dashed out Wenlock's brains with a battle axe before seeking sanctuary in the abbey. As its morale collapsed, the rest of the Lancastrian army tried to flee, but the Swale Gate became a deadly barrier. Many who succeeded in crossing it converged on the mill south of the town of Tewkesbury and on a weir in the town itself, where they were crossing over the Avon. Here too, many drowned or were killed by the pursuers. The Prince of Wales was slain on the field during the retreat of some of Clarence's men. Despite pleading for help to Clarence, who had sworn allegiance to him in France barely a year before, they cut him down. Many of the other Lancastrian nobles and knights tried to seek sanctuary in Tewkesbury Abbey, but King Edward attended prayers in the abbey shortly after the battle. He granted permission for the Prince of Wales and others slain in the battle to be buried within the abbey or elsewhere in the town without being quartered as traitorous, which was customary at this time. However, 2 days after the battle, Somerset and then the other leaders were dragged out of the abbey and ordered by Gloucester and the Duke of Norfolk to be put to death. And a few days later, Queen Margaret sent word from her refuge that she was at his commandment. So this became the end of the Lancastrian royal family. For Gloucester would marry Anne Neville, the youngest daughter of Warwick and the widow of Henry and Margaret's son Edward. With the deaths of Somerset and his younger brother, the House of Beaufort, who were distant cousins of Henry, had a remote claim to succeed him. Lady Margaret Beaufort and her son, Henry Tudor, would later become King Henry VII. Henry escaped from Wales with Jasper Tudor, his paternal uncle, and remained in exile in Brittany for the remainder of Edward's reign. The year after the Battle of Tewkesbury, however, Lady Margaret married Lord Stanley, one of the King Edward's supporters, who later turned against Edward's brother, Richard of Gloucester, when he became king as Richard III, and was instrumental in putting Henry Tudor on the throne.